The night I realized my son had been holding her breath for years, I was standing in the hallway with a basket of unfolded laundry, listening to silence that felt heavier than sound. I remember thinking how strange it was that a house could feel crowded with memories and yet so empty of truth. My child, my quiet, brilliant, painfully observant child, had been drifting away from me in small, careful increments. Not rebellion, not anger, something softer, something guarded, like a secret wrapped in layers of politeness. I used to think good parenting meant paying attention to noise, slammed doors, raised voices, slammed grades. But that night taught me that the most important things hide in the quiet spaces. I knocked on the bedroom door, without meaning to. My knuckles barely touched the wood before I froze, suddenly afraid of interrupting something sacred. Inside, there was movement, a shuffle, a breath held too long. "Come in," came the voice I had known since lullabies and scraped knees. Still familiar, still my child's. And yet, something in it wavered, like a reflection disturbed by water. The room smelled faintly of fabric softener and nervous sweat. My eyes adjusted slowly, and at first I didn't see anything unusual. Just posters half peeled from the walls, a desk cluttered with notebooks, a mirror angled away from the door. Then my gaze landed on the bed. Folded neatly beside my son, no, beside my child, was a blouse. Soft, pale blue. The kind I might have worn years ago, without thinking twice. Time did something strange then. It stretched, bent, became unreliable. I remember my heart thudding, not in alarm, but recognition. A puzzle piece clicking into place so quietly it almost hurt. "I can explain," my child said quickly, eyes darting anywhere but at me. Shoulders curled inward, like they were trying to disappear into bone. I sat down on the edge of the bed without asking permission, the laundry basket forgotten in the hallway. I could feel the weight of 1,000 parenting books pressing uselessly against my spine. None of them had prepared me for this moment, yet somehow it felt like I had been preparing for it all along. "You don't have to," I said, and the truth of it surprised both of us. Silence again. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was trembling. The words came out in fragments after that. Not a confession. Not a declaration. Just feelings spilled carefully, like someone afraid of breaking glass. My child talked about mirrors that felt wrong, about clothes that felt like armor instead of expression, about a name that fit in public, but scratched on the inside. I listened, and with every sentence, a quiet grief surfaced. Not grief for what I was losing, but grief for how alone they had been. When my child finally looked at me, eyes glossy with fear, I saw it clearly. This wasn't about clothes. It wasn't about defiance or confusion or phases. It was about survival. "I don't know what I am," my child whispered. "I just know that when I imagine myself as her, I can breathe." That word, her, didn't echo. It settled. I reached out, hesitated, then placed my hand over theirs. Their fingers were cold. I wondered how long they had been afraid to be warm. "You don't have to know everything tonight," I said. "We can learn together." The exhale that followed was sharp, almost painful, like a lung unused to oxygen. Later, much later, I stood alone in the kitchen, staring at my reflection in the dark window. I saw a parent who had been given a fragile, extraordinary responsibility. Not to decide, not to direct, but to protect the space where truth could grow. That was the night my son didn't disappear. That was the night my daughter began to exist. And I had no idea how much both of our lives were about to change. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was afraid, but because my mind kept replaying moments I had misunderstood for years, memories rearranging themselves with a new gravity. Every hesitation before a school photo, every refusal to go clothes shopping, every joke delivered a beat too late, like a translation that never quite matched the original language of her thoughts. Morning arrived quietly. Too quietly. I stood in the kitchen pretending to drink coffee that had gone cold, listening for footsteps, wondering if daylight would undo what had been spoken in the dark. Some truths retreat when exposed to sun. This one didn't. She came out of her room wearing the same oversized hoodie she always wore, but something had shifted. Her posture was different, not confident yet, but less folded and on itself. Like someone who had set down a heavy bag, unsure whether it was safe to walk away from it. "Good morning," I said, deliberately normal, as if the word normal hadn't just been redefined. "Morning," she replied, then stopped, eyes flicking up to mine. There it was. The question she didn't ask. "Are we still okay?" I smiled, small but real. She nodded once, like she'd been holding a breath all over again and had just been reminded she could let it go. The days that followed felt like walking on a frozen lake. Every step careful, every sound amplified. I didn't want to rush her, didn't want to turn her becoming into a project or a spectacle. At the same time, I was terrified of doing nothing and letting silence swallow her again. So I started with listening. Not the kind that waits for its turn to speak, but the kind that leaves space. She talked more when I didn't fill the gaps. About how she'd tried on clothes when the house was empty, how she'd practiced smiling in the mirror because it felt different when she imagined herself as someone else. About the name she whispered only in her head. Hearing it out loud for the first time felt like watching someone step onto a stage they'd been rehearsing on alone for years. It wasn't dramatic. It was fragile, sacred. I practiced using it when she wasn't around, saying it quietly while folding laundry, letting it feel unfamiliar in my mouth until it didn't. The first time she asked me if we could go shopping together, her voice shook so badly I almost missed the words. Not to the mall. Not somewhere public. Just a small thrift store across town where no one knew us, where the clothes didn't come with expectations. I said yes too quickly, then worried I'd said it wrong. In the car, she stared out the window, fingers twisting the hem of her hoodie into knots. I wanted to tell her she was brave, but bravery felt like the wrong word. This wasn't courage in the heroic sense. This was necessity. Inside the store, the air smelled like dust and detergent. Racks crowded together, time compressed into fabric. She hovered near the entrance, frozen, until I picked up a cardigan and held it up casually, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. "Soft," I said. She reached out with 2 fingers, barely touching it, like it might disappear if she committed. When she finally held it against herself, her eyes changed. Not wide, not shocked, just aligned. We didn't buy much that day. A top. A pair of jeans that fit her hips differently than she expected. At home, she locked herself in her room to try them on. I waited outside, pretending to clean, pretending my heart wasn't pounding like I was waiting for test results. When she opened the door, she didn't step fully into the hallway. Just enough for me to see. She wasn't transformed. Not magically. Not completely. But something undeniable had surfaced. Her shoulders were back. Her eyes met mine without flinching. "Is this okay?" she asked. I swallowed. "It's more than okay." That night, she cried, not the quiet, private crying I'd overheard through walls before, but the kind that asks to be witnessed. I held her, feeling the years she'd spent holding herself together alone. Not everything moved forward smoothly after that. There were days she retreated again, days she panicked over how her voice sounded, how her body moved, how the world might see her if it ever really looked. School became a minefield of what-ifs. Family gatherings loomed like storms on the horizon. And I had my own fears. Not about who she was, but about how unkind the world could be to someone brave enough to be honest. Loving her meant learning how to be afraid without letting that fear lead. The first time someone misgendered her after she'd quietly asked to be called she, I felt something sharp twist in my chest. She laughed it off too quickly. I made a note of it. The way she'd learned to protect others from her pain by pretending not to feel it. So I started correcting people gently. Casually. Not making a scene. Letting her see that she didn't have to fight every battle alone. One evening, she stood beside me in the bathroom as I took off my makeup. She watched closely, like it was a lesson, like there was a secret hidden in routine. "Did it take you a long time to feel like yourself?" she asked. The question landed deeper than she knew. "I'm still learning," I said. She smiled then, small and sincere, and for the first time, I saw not just my child, but a young woman becoming herself in real time. awkward, thoughtful, unfinished. I realized then that this journey wasn't about letting go of my son. That version of her had never truly existed the way the world thought. What I was doing was finally meeting my daughter, where she had always been, waiting. And somewhere between thrift store hangers and whispered names, between fear and tenderness, I understood something vital. Parenting isn't about raising who you expect. It's about recognizing who arrives. The first time she left the house presenting as herself, I nearly collapsed under the weight of pride and terror tangled together. She had chosen a simple dress, not flashy, not daring, just the kind of soft, flowing fabric that mirrored the softness I had seen in her eyes since she was a little kid. Her hair fell around her face differently now, longer at the front, framing her expression in a way that made me realize I was seeing her as she always wanted to be seen. "Do I look okay?" she asked, voice hesitant, laced with a faint tremor of uncertainty. I took a deep breath. Words felt too fragile. I wanted to give her the world in one sentence, but all I could do was smile and say, "You look like you've been waiting to be yourself." She hesitated at the threshold of the door, fingers brushing the edge of the frame, as if testing whether the world would be soft enough to let her through. I wanted to reach for her hand, but I knew she needed to step forward alone. So I stood back, pretending to check my phone, praying silently for kindness to follow her out. The walk to the bus stop was a symphony of micro-anxieties. Every glance, every whisper in the wind felt amplified. When a neighbor waved, unsure how to address her, she froze for a second. Then she smiled politely, nodded, and kept walking. My chest tightened with admiration. She was discovering courage in ways I hadn't imagined, one small interaction at a time. School was harder. Not all of it, but enough. Some students whispered behind her back. A few were supportive but cautious, unsure how to navigate this new reality. She came home one day with tear-streaked cheeks and slammed her bag onto the floor, furious not with them, but with the unfairness of having to justify her existence. I sat beside her on the couch, letting her rage fill the room without interruption. "I hate it," she finally said, voice breaking. "Why does everything have to be so hard just to be me?" I didn't have answers. No one does in moments like that. But I could offer presence, the knowledge that she wasn't facing it alone. "Because the world isn't always ready for people to be honest," I said softly. "But that doesn't mean you're wrong. It means you're brave." It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but over the next weeks I saw her change in ways that didn't require words. The way she walked down the hall with a little more confidence, the way she laughed more openly in our living room, the way she experimented with eyeliner and nail polish in her room without hesitation. One night, she came to me holding a pair of high-heeled shoes she had found at a thrift store, bright red and impossibly tall. Her fingers hovered over them like she was negotiating with gravity itself. "Do you think I can?" she started. "Yes," I said immediately, but then paused, realizing I didn't mean just walking in them. I meant everything she was trying to do. Exist unapologetically, challenge her fears, defy expectations. "Yes, you can. And you'll do it beautifully." The first steps were wobbly. She laughed, a mix of exhilaration and disbelief, and I laughed too. Something about that moment was transformative, a symbol of all the small, painstaking victories that would define her path. Her voice began to change too, not drastically, but in subtle tones, softer in some places, more deliberate in others. She practiced speaking in front of the mirror, refining the pitch and cadence until it felt right to her, not forced. And I learned to listen not just to the words, but to the pauses, the inflections, the tiny shifts that revealed who she was becoming. Family gatherings became a minefield of emotions. Some relatives embraced her with warmth, others hesitated, unsure how to reconcile the child they knew with the young woman she was becoming. I found myself navigating delicate conversations, advocating without creating conflict, protecting her dignity without silencing the doubts that naturally arose in her heart. One Sunday afternoon, after a particularly tense gathering, she curled up beside me on the couch, her knees tucked under her chin. "Do you think they'll ever understand?" she whispered. I stroked her hair, the same way I used to when she was 5 and scared of thunderstorms. Some will. Some won't. But the ones who matter, the ones who love you, they already do. She leaned into me, her presence warm and familiar, and for the first time in a long while, I felt that the gap between who she was and who she wanted to be was shrinking. Not gone, not perfect, but becoming something beautiful and tangible. And in that moment, I realized that this journey, the one I hadn't planned for, the one I hadn't studied in any parenting book, was teaching me as much as it was teaching her. About patience, about unconditional love, about the courage it takes to simply exist as yourself in a world that often resists truth. Her laughter began to fill the house more often, not forced, not hidden. She experimented with outfits, blending colors and textures, learning her own aesthetic. I watched quietly, sometimes offering feedback, mostly just marveling at how alive she was becoming. One evening, after months of tentative steps forward, she came to me holding a small diary. "I've been writing," she said, cheeks flushed. "Everything I'm feeling, it's easier to understand when it's on paper." I nodded, feeling tears prick the edges of my eyes. "That's wonderful. Writing is powerful. It helps you claim your story, in your own words." She smiled shyly, handing me the diary. I flipped through pages filled with sketches, reflections, and raw honesty. It was a window into her world, her fears, her hopes, her triumphs. And I felt honored to witness it. As the weeks passed, I began noticing something subtle but profound. She moved through the world with a sense of self that wasn't defined by what others thought, but by what she felt to be true. Each choice, clothes, gestures, words, colors, was a declaration of identity, and I was learning to see her not as a project or a problem, but as a complete, evolving person. It started with a phone call that made my stomach twist into knots. One of her friends had posted something online, a picture of her from school with a caption that was not cruel exactly, but careless in a way that cut deep. She didn't want me to see it at first, but I did anyway, and when I did, my heart clenched. Her reaction surprised me. She didn't cry. She didn't lash out. She just stood in the middle of the living room, hands clenched into tiny fists at her sides, and let the words sink in. I could see the war going on inside her. The desire to shrug it off, the desire to retaliate, the fear that maybe the world would never accept her fully. "I don't get why people can't just let me be," she finally whispered, voice tight with frustration and exhaustion. I walked over and knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes people are careless. Sometimes they don't understand. But that doesn't mean you're wrong, and it doesn't mean you're alone." She shook her head, and for a moment I wondered if my words were too little, too late. But then she exhaled, a shaky breath that carried months of bottled-up tension, and leaned into me. It became clear in that moment that the journey wasn't just about her discovering herself. It was about me learning how to support her when the world tried to push her back. And the world did try. Teachers who used the wrong pronouns accidentally or dismissively. Kids who whispered and stared. Strangers who asked questions with curiosity that felt invasive. Each incident was a test, and each time she faced it, she grew a little taller inside. There were nights when she cried quietly in her room after school, and I would sit outside the door, listening, sometimes knocking gently, sometimes just letting her sob without interruption. I never offered easy solutions, because there weren't any. What I offered instead was presence. Stability. The knowledge that no matter how the world shifted, I would not waver. One evening, she asked me to help her pick out makeup for a school event. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't sure how to navigate this world of brushes, powders, and subtle shadings. She laughed at my hesitation, a sound so pure and light I almost cried. "You just watch, Dad. Follow my lead," she said. We spread out the products across her bedroom desk, and she instructed me with patience, explaining techniques I had never considered. I realized then that she wasn't just learning to present herself outwardly, she was learning to command her space, to assert her identity with calm confidence. The first time she left the house fully made up and dressed in what she considered her best self, I felt my chest tighten in a mix of pride, awe, and fear. Fear not because of her, but because I understood what it meant to send someone so vulnerable into the world, and how easily that world could wound her. She turned to me before walking out the door. "Do I look okay?" "You look like you were born to shine," I said, voice catching slightly. She smiled, a genuine, wide smile that seemed to light the room, and stepped outside. School events became a crucible of emotions. Some peers were supportive, offering compliments and encouragement. Others were awkward, misinformed, or indifferent. And every interaction taught her something new, not about fashion or appearances, but about resilience, about setting boundaries, about holding her own in a world that sometimes refused to see her clearly. At home, the dynamic between us began to shift. She started asking for advice, then disregarding it confidently. She experimented with clothing, hairstyles, and even accessories, sometimes coming out of her room looking like a completely different person, yet always herself. It was thrilling and terrifying all at once. I felt privileged to witness the unfolding of someone discovering her own narrative, writing it line by line. One night, after a particularly challenging day at school where someone had loudly misgendered her in the cafeteria, she came home and collapsed onto the couch, exhausted. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she said quietly, the weight of the day pressing down. I knelt beside her, taking her hand in mine. "You don't have to do it alone. We'll figure it out together. One step at a time." We sat in silence, her small hand clasped in mine, and I realized that every tear she shed, every moment of fear, was also a moment of bravery. She was learning to navigate the world as her true self, and I was learning to navigate it alongside her without trying to shield her from every challenge. There were lighter moments, too. Days when she experimented with a new dress, twirling in front of the mirror, laughing at how awkward she looked at first. Days when she and I would try out hairstyles on each other, giggling at mismatched bangs or clumsy braids. Those moments felt like little islands of pure joy in a sea of complexity. One evening, after a long day of ups and downs, she looked at me with eyes I barely recognized. "I think I'm finally starting to feel like me," she said softly, almost a whisper. I felt tears sting my own eyes. "I see you," I said. "And you're amazing." She smiled then, that quiet, knowing smile that told me she understood something fundamental, that her identity wasn't contingent on anyone else's approval. She was learning self-acceptance, and I was learning how to be a witness, a guide, and a parent in the truest sense of the word. Even with setbacks, even with moments of doubt, I realized something important. Transformation isn't linear. It's messy, unpredictable, full of twists, yet breathtakingly beautiful. And through it all, she was teaching me about courage, identity, and the power of simply letting someone exist fully. It happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, but I noticed one morning that she walked into the kitchen differently. There was a lightness to her step, a subtle curve of her shoulders, and when she looked at me, her eyes held a steadiness that had been missing before. Months of struggle, hesitation, and quiet victories had begun to crystallize into something palpable: confidence. Not arrogance, not performative, just the quiet knowledge that she belonged in her own skin. School became less of a battlefield and more of a testing ground. She started asserting herself in small ways that felt monumental. Correcting someone who misgendered her, without flinching. Volunteering in class discussions. Joining a small group for a school project and speaking up, letting her ideas be heard, letting her presence be known. Each act was like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples she could feel and I could see. One Friday afternoon, she invited me to come with her to a small gathering at a friend's house. Her voice had a note of pride I hadn't heard before. "I want you to meet everyone as me," she said. That tiny phrase, "as me," carried years of longing, fear, and determination. I agreed immediately, my own heart pounding with a mix of joy and apprehension. I wasn't worried about her courage. She had it in abundance by now, but I feared the world outside our home. When we arrived, she greeted her friends warmly, hands steady, smile genuine. They embraced her fully, naturally, as if the girl I had watched grow in our living room had always existed in the world. And in that moment, the tension I hadn't even realized I'd been holding melted away. She belonged. She had arrived. Later, when we were alone, she turned to me, cheeks flushed with excitement. "Did you see that? They didn't hesitate. They just accepted me." I nodded, swallowing back my own tears. "I saw. And I'm so proud of you." There were setbacks, of course. Not everyone was understanding, and she still faced microaggressions and the occasional cruel remark. But I noticed something remarkable. She no longer folded inward. Each challenge became an opportunity to affirm herself, to practice resilience, to own her identity without apology. Home became our sanctuary in new ways. She would experiment with outfits, hairstyles, accessories, and makeup, testing boundaries not to please anyone, but to understand herself. She became meticulous, patient, and even playful in how she curated her appearance. I often watched from a distance, amazed at the joy radiating from her, a joy I hadn't seen before this journey began. One evening, she came to me holding a small stack of drawings. "I've been trying to capture how I feel," she said, voice soft but certain. She flipped through pages filled with sketches, some abstract, some literal, all imbued with a raw honesty that made my chest ache. "These are incredible," I said. "Each one tells a story. And you're the author of every single one." She smiled, shy but proud. "I'm learning who I am piece by piece." The breakthrough came unexpectedly. She had been working on a presentation for school, a personal narrative, something her teacher encouraged as part of a project about identity. She practiced at home, stumbling over words, then refining them, her voice growing steadier with each rehearsal. The day she presented, I waited in the school auditorium, not visible, but present. When she stepped onto the stage, she held herself with a calm I didn't know she possessed. Her voice carried across the room, clear and unwavering. She spoke about her journey, about the challenges she faced, about discovering herself amidst fear and doubt. She didn't demand sympathy. She didn't dramatize. She simply told the truth of her existence. I could see heads turn, expressions shift, murmurs ripple across the audience. But through it all, she remained composed, her authenticity radiating like light through the dim auditorium. And in that moment, I realized she had crossed an invisible threshold. She wasn't just surviving. She was thriving. Afterward, her friends surrounded her, offering hugs, smiles, and words of support. She came out beaming, her eyes sparkling, and turned to me. "I did it, Dad. I really did it." I enveloped her in a hug, feeling the strength in her body, the confidence in her presence. "You did. And I've never been more proud." That night, at home, she lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling. "It feels real," she murmured. "Like I'm finally living in the right skin." I sat beside her, not needing to say much. Presence spoke louder than words. But I did whisper, "You are real. And you are enough." Over the following weeks, I watched her flourish in ways that astonished me. She joined a creative writing club, shared her drawings at school exhibitions, and even helped younger students navigate their own insecurities. She was becoming a beacon for others, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet power of being unapologetically herself. And yet, despite the victories, there were still moments of fragility. Nights when self-doubt crept in, when the world's indifference or cruelty threatened to undo the progress she had fought so hard to achieve. Those nights were the hardest for both of us. I learned that supporting her wasn't about shielding her from pain. It was about being steady when the world wasn't, being her anchor while she navigated storms she could not control. One evening, she came into my room, notebook in hand, a hesitant expression on her face. "Can I show you something?" I nodded. She flipped to a page filled with words, handwritten in careful script. It was a poem, raw and unfiltered, about fear, courage, and the exhilaration of becoming herself. She read it aloud, voice trembling at first, then gaining strength as the words carried her forward. When she finished, I took a deep breath, struggling to hold back tears. "That was incredible," I said. "You've captured everything I've seen in you. The fear, the growth, the light. You've put it into words." She smiled, small but triumphant. I think I finally believe it too. That I can be me." In that moment, I realized the journey we were on wasn't just about transformation, it was about reclamation. Reclaiming identity, confidence, dignity, and joy. And as I watched her curl up with her notebook, a quiet serenity settling over her face, I knew that she had crossed a threshold into a space where she could thrive, not just exist. It was a crisp Saturday morning when she asked me if I would come with her to the local art fair. She had been planning it for weeks, not because it was a particularly big event, but because it was small, familiar, and, more importantly, public. I knew this wasn't just about art. It was a statement, a test, a step into the world on her own terms. She had chosen an outfit carefully. A soft lavender blouse, paired with a skirt that moved with her like water, and shoes she had practiced walking in all week. Her hair was braided loosely, framing her face in a way that made her look calm, poised, and completely herself. When she turned to me for my opinion, I found myself speechless for a moment, overwhelmed by the quiet strength radiating from her. "You look perfect," I said finally, the word inadequate, yet all I had. She smiled at me, small but radiant, a mix of pride and nerves that mirrored my own emotions. As we walked through the fair, I noticed how she carried herself differently. She didn't shrink or avoid gazes. She met eyes with strangers, answered questions with confidence, laughed easily when people complimented her art, and held her head high when someone stumbled over a pronoun. Every step was deliberate, every gesture a quiet assertion of identity. And then it happened. One of the local organizers asked if she would like to present her work in front of a small crowd. She hesitated, a flash of doubt crossing her face, but then something shifted. She nodded firmly. "Yes," she said, and in that simple word, I heard months of struggle, practice, and courage condensed into a single moment. I watched as she stepped onto the small stage, her body relaxed but alert, notebook clutched lightly in her hands. She began to speak, first softly, then gaining strength as she described her journey, her art, and the truth she had been discovering about herself. The audience listened, captivated, not just by her art, but by the sincerity, the vulnerability, and the courage she embodied. Afterward, people approached her, complimented her, asked questions, and some even shared their own stories. She beamed, laughing with a lightness I hadn't seen before, her cheeks flushed with pride and relief. I stood nearby, heart swelling, realizing that she had claimed a space in the world for herself, not asking permission, not waiting for approval, but simply existing in her truth. Later, at home, she collapsed onto her bed, exhausted but glowing. "I can't believe I did that," she said softly. "You did," I replied, sitting beside her. "And you are amazing." She rolled onto her side, looking at me with a mixture of wonder and vulnerability. Sometimes I forget that people can actually see me, that I can be visible and safe at the same time. I held her hand. Visibility doesn't always come with safety, but courage makes it possible to step forward anyway. And you make it look effortless. That night, as I tucked her in, she whispered, "Thank you for staying with me, for seeing me." I kissed her forehead, feeling the weight of her trust, the fragility, and the strength interwoven in her presence. "Always," I said. "I will always see you." The following weeks were a mix of exhilaration and new challenges. Friends at school began to notice her confidence, some admiring, others unsure how to respond. There were moments of friction, whispered comments, small misunderstandings, but she no longer crumbled. She confronted them, calmly and clearly, asserting her identity with a strength that left me in awe. At home, our bond deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. Conversations became richer, more honest. She shared thoughts and fears she hadn't voiced before, and I listened, not as a parent dictating the path, but as a companion walking beside her. We shared late-night talks, sometimes laughing, sometimes silent, just existing in each other's presence. One evening, she asked me to teach her something I had never realized could feel so intimate: how to navigate conflict with grace. We practiced conversations, role-playing scenarios, and I watched as she absorbed the lessons, refining her own responses until they felt authentic. The pivotal moment came unexpectedly during a family gathering. She wore a dress she had chosen herself, the kind that made her feel powerful. I watched nervously as relatives arrived, unsure how they would react. Some hesitated, some stared, but she held her head high, smiled warmly, and greeted them with the confidence she had been cultivating. At one point, my cousin misgendered her, an accidental slip, but the words hit harder than intended. She paused, took a deep breath, and said clearly, "Please call me she. That's who I am." There was a moment of tension, a collective pause, and then acceptance. The room shifted. Conversations resumed, and I realized she had commanded respect not through argument, but through calm assertion and self-possession. Later that night, she hugged me tightly. "I did it, Dad. I didn't crumble. I really didn't." "You've come so far," I whispered. "I've watched you grow stronger every day. You've earned this confidence." She smiled, tears glimmering in her eyes. "It feels real, like I finally exist the way I'm supposed to." And in that moment, I understood something fundamental. Transformation isn't only about outward appearance. It's about claiming one's space, asserting identity, and living authentically despite fear and uncertainty. She had done all of that and more. The mornings grew easier, not because the world had changed, but because she had. I watched her move through our home with a quiet certainty I had never seen before, each gesture deliberate, each step measured, each glance in a mirror full of recognition. She no longer tested herself against invisible expectations. She simply existed as herself, and in that, she radiated a light that made the house feel warmer, fuller, and alive in ways it never had before. School continued to have its challenges, but they no longer intimidated her. Friends came and went, some embracing her fully, others struggling to keep pace with her courage. And still she walked undeterred, her voice firm when correcting pronouns, her laughter clear and unrestrained when she was happy, her presence undeniable in the classroom and the hallways alike. Every small victory, every subtle act of self-assertion, had built a foundation of confidence I could see etched into the curve of her shoulders, the brightness in her eyes, the rhythm of her step. One evening, after a long day, she came to me with a notebook in hand, cheeks flushed, hair falling over her face in soft waves. "I've been writing again," she said, a hint of shy pride in her voice. "Do you want to read it?" I nodded. She opened the notebook and began to read aloud, her words flowing with a vulnerability and strength that caught me off guard. She spoke of fears, triumphs, doubts, and acceptance, not just her own, but ours as a family navigating unfamiliar terrain together. Her writing was raw, honest, and beautiful, and as I listened, I realized she had not only discovered herself, she had articulated her journey with courage, reflection, and grace. When she finished, she looked at me, eyes glimmering with hope. "Do you think I'm okay?" I took her hands in mine, feeling the warmth and steadiness in them. "You're more than okay. You're incredible. And every day, you remind me what it means to truly be brave." We sat together in silence for a while, just breathing, letting the weight of the moment settle. There was a sense of peace, not because everything was perfect, but because authenticity had replaced fear. She was free to be herself, and I was free to witness it without doubt, judgment, or hesitation. The family adapted, too. Relatives who had struggled with understanding gradually accepted her fully. We celebrated small victories: a birthday party without hesitation, a school award ceremony where she confidently accepted recognition as herself, a family dinner where laughter and conversation flowed easily. There were no dramatic declarations, just a quiet harmony that had grown stronger with each passing week. One afternoon, she stood by the window, sunlight catching her hair, and I realized how much she had changed, not in a way that erased her past, but in a way that embraced it fully. The girl who had once hidden behind hoodies and whispered names had emerged as a young woman who met the world head-on, with honesty, patience, and a grace that left me in awe. She turned to me, a soft smile on her lips. "Thank you for staying, for helping me find myself." I swallowed back emotion I hadn't expected to feel so deeply. "You don't need me to thank me. I'm proud to walk beside you. Every step you take, you teach me what courage really is." That night, as we prepared for bed, she lingered at the doorway, hesitant yet confident. "Do you think I can keep being me no matter what?" I held her gaze, feeling a lifetime of love, fear, pride, and joy all converge in one moment. "I don't just think it, you already are. And I'll always be here, watching, supporting, loving you for exactly who you are." She smiled, finally relaxed, and whispered, "I feel whole." And in that moment, I understood that this journey, our journey, wasn't about transformation as a spectacle or about changing to fit anyone's expectations. It was about becoming real, being seen, and embracing identity with honesty and love. She had arrived at self-acceptance, and I had arrived at a deeper understanding of what it meant to parent someone who dares to live authentically. We sat together, the quiet hum of our home surrounding us. I thought of all the nights of fear, the days of doubt, the moments of triumph and heartbreak, and I realized that every single step had been worth it. Because she existed now, fully, unapologetically, beautifully herself. And I, her parent, had been privileged to witness every heartbeat, every breath, every moment of courage along the way. The future remained uncertain in the world outside, but inside our home, inside the space we had created together, there was only love, pride, and the quiet certainty that she would continue to grow, to shine, to be exactly who she was meant to be. And for the first time in years, I slept with a heart entirely unburdened, knowing that my daughter, my brilliant, fearless daughter, was home, in every sense of the word.